Welcome to the Justice Journal podcast. I'm Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert. I hope you enjoy this podcast series where we discuss important public safety issues and provide insight into who we are as an office and what we do both in the courtroom and in the community to provide the highest level of public safety through prosecution, prevention, and innovation.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Justice Journal podcast. I'm your host, Shelley Oreo. As we enter the holiday celebratory season, this episode will focus on the all too often tragic consequences of driving under the influence of alcohol and/or drugs, otherwise known as DUI and DUID. I'm joined by a very special guest today, Rhonda Campbell, who will share her very personal experience of losing a loved one to a DUI offender. I'm also joined by Lead Deputy District Attorney Greg Hayes, who oversees the office's DUI and DUID prosecution and education program. Welcome, Rhonda and Greg.
Thank you.
Rhonda, can you please start by introducing yourself and let us know what your current role is?
My name is Rhonda Campbell. I am the lead victim advocate for the state of California for Mothers Against Drunk Driving.
Perfect. And Greg?
Thank you. My name is Greg Hayes. I'm a deputy district attorney here in Sacramento County. I've been working for the DA's office for a little over 8 years now. I've worked in misdemeanors, felonies, arraignments, and in career criminal prosecution. During my time as a DA, I prosecuted numerous DUIs and vehicular homicides. Currently, I'm a lead prosecutor in the misdemeanor unit of our office. In my role, I'm responsible for the office's DUI and drug DUI prosecution and education program. This program is funded by a grant from the California Office of Traffic Safety. What you're listening to now is part of a 4-part podcast series that's related to the grant.
Great. Thank you, Greg. Rhonda, I'm going to start with you and just ask you to, like I said earlier, share your very personal story. And then Greg will bring you back in discussion after we hear from Rhonda.
Sure. So I guess if I go back to when I was a teenager back in the 70s and early 80s, we were a family of 4, my parents and I and my sister Irene, and we were probably what you would call very typical middle America family of 4. We weren't rich, we weren't poor. Maybe from the outside looking in, people would have considered us poor, but my parents worked very hard so that we didn't think we were poor. And we were just typical family. Boy, we did everything together. My sister and I were very involved in sports. We were outdoorsy people. We did a lot of camping, fishing. My dad was an outdoorsman. He taught us all of the things that you would want your daughters to know. And let me tell you, he did not miss not having a boy, because he took his girls and he taught us how to be self-sufficient. We could bait a hook, we could shoot a gun, we could change a tire, we could do anything we needed to do. He made sure we were independent and were able to take care of ourselves. And we were really, really close family. Some of the things we loved to do were amusement parks. My sister we were avid athletes. She was more than I. We played softball. She was very big into tournament softball. So we spent a lot of weekends doing tournaments and playing in sports. And, my parents were kind of the keep us busy, keep us out of trouble kind of people. So we were always on the go doing something, and we were happy. We were very, very happy and content and just living life to the fullest as you would expect us to be as teenagers.
So you mentioned your sister, Irene.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you tell us more about her and what was she like as a sister growing up? And what do you remember most about her?
I have to say what I remember most about her is her look. She was so particular about the way she looked. And I laugh now. Some people will get the reference and some won't. But she had the Farrah Fawcett hairdo, which at the time was the big feathered, wavy hairdo. And I told you a minute ago, she was an avid softball player. And I don't know how she could do it, but she would go out and play 6 innings of softball with a hat on, take that hat off, and her hair was just like it was when she started, that Farrah Fawcett feather do. So she just loved to look beautiful, and she was happy, outgoing, and she was a generous, giving kid. And one of the things that was very dear to her heart as a 12-year-old was working with mentally challenged children. And she would actually give up her spare time. So instead of doing extracurricular activities at school, she would get bused to another local school and work with children that were mentally challenged. And that was her passion in life. So when she wasn't doing something for herself, playing softball or doing kid things, that's where her heart was, is working with children who had mental challenges. And she just loved it. And I'm convinced that in her future, that's what she was going to be doing, is working with people who needed that kind of help. And she was really good at it and passionate about it.
Wow. And at that very young age too.
Yeah. Very young age. She'd already started her path forward.
Wow. Well, so let's move on. And can you now talk us through the terrible day that you and your family lost Irene? However much you want to share about what happened and how you found out.
Sure. We had been in a softball tournament. It was August of 1981. We came home in the afternoon, and I was 15, Irene was 12. And that afternoon, I started having some abdominal pains, and it progressed into the evening to the point where my parents felt like I should probably be seen by a doctor. They took me in, and they thought maybe it was appendicitis. And so they checked me into the hospital. Back in the 80s, children couldn't be in a children's ward at a hospital. And so I was checked into the hospital, but Irene, being 12 years old, she wasn't allowed to come in. And so my parents had a really difficult decision to make. Either leave me alone at the hospital, leave Irene alone at home at 12 years old, split up. It was all something that wasn't common for my family to do. Ultimately, what happened is my neighbor and my best friend's mother called and said, "Hey guys, we know you want to be with Rhonda tonight. We'll take Irene with us. We're going to go to Elk Grove. We'll buy her dinner. We're going to go visit some family, and we'll have her home by 9:00 tonight. That way you can go visit with Rhonda. Irene will be with us, and everybody will be taken care of." It was still a difficult decision for my parents because that wasn't something they typically would let us do. We were very much kept in our pod of four. They didn't let us go with other people too often, but because they wanted to be with me and didn't want me to be alone that night, they agreed and they let her go. My dad tells the part of the story from here is that as he was getting ready to come to the hospital, he heard Irene and my friend giggling out in the front yard, and he slid open the tiny bathroom window to see them getting ready to walk down to my friend's house. And he said to Irene, "Bye, baby. I love you. Please tell Joyce to drive careful tonight. I don't need two kids in the hospital." And little did he know those would be the last words that he ever got to speak to my sister. As fate would have it, that night on their way home from Elk Grove, a 4-time repeat offender ran a stop sign going 60 miles an hour and hit the car my baby sister was riding in head on. The impact killed my best friend's mother instantly and left my baby sister alone on the road dying. The person that hit them did not try to render aid, did not call for help. He was very concerned about himself, which ultimately ended up being a bloody lip. I was still in the hospital, and being the 80s, we didn't have the instant communication, so I didn't know anything was wrong. Mom and Dad didn't even know anything was wrong until 9:00 came and went that night, and Irene wasn't home. They started calling around, searching for her, searching for Joyce, searching for the car, searching for a clue as to when they left or what route they took. And much later that evening, they did finally get an answer on the phone at my friend's house, and it was the Sacramento County coroner. And he told my parents that there had been a crash, that Joyce had been killed, and that there had been a young Jane Doe in the car with her that had been taken to UC Davis in critical condition. She was taken as a Jane Doe because at 12 years old, she didn't carry an ID. Most 12-year-olds probably don't carry an ID. But my parents knew the likelihood was this was my sister, so they loaded back into the car and immediately drove to UC Davis Hospital. Walked through the front doors of that hospital, and my dad's last words to my sister were now his reality. He had 2 kids in 2 different hospitals that night. They walked in and asked to see the young Jane Doe that had been brought in the crash. And it wasn't that simple. You can't just walk in a hospital and ask to see somebody that you don't know. You have to have some tie to them. So that brought on some conversations about what does she look like? How old is she? Well, she looked a little bit older than 12, so that wasn't helpful. What was she wearing? Well, her clothes had been cut off at the crash scene, so that wasn't helpful. Ultimately, some nurses brought out a tiny pair of blue Nike tennis shoes. And they said, the girl we have here was wearing these shoes. And my parents knew those were my baby sister's shoes that she'd been wearing that night. And so that's how they knew that their baby was there. My dad was taken back to see Irene one time. And he said, here we're going to talk about hair again. He said, if it weren't for her hair, he wouldn't have known who she was. She'd been riding in the front seat of the car, so she took the impact pretty fully to her head and face. She had a swollen head, face, facial cuts, bruises, things like that. She was also hooked up to a lot of medical equipment. But he said he did reach out and touch her one time, and when he did that, her skin was ice cold. And he said, I knew right then that this was not going to be a good outcome. It was not going to be good news. He went back to the waiting room where my mom was, and he said it seemed like the doctor followed him right behind him and came out and told my parents that my sister had passed. They had to leave that hospital that night and go home to an empty house because I was still in a hospital on the other side of town. I woke up very early the next morning to my dad and my uncle standing in my hospital room. And I knew something was wrong. It was just too early for them to be there. My uncle was there. Everything about the situation was uncomfortable. And I asked him, I said, Daddy, what's wrong? What are you doing here? And he said, nothing's wrong, baby. Your mama wants you to come home. I knew something was wrong. We got in the car and went on what was probably in my lifetime the longest, quietest, scariest car ride I've ever been on. Got to my house, walked through the front door, and it felt like the air was literally pulled out of my lungs. Something very heavy was coming. My parents sat me down on the couch and they said, we have bad news. Joyce and your baby sister were both killed by a drunk driver last night. And, you have those things that hit you in life that you'll never forget. And clearly that's one of mine. But the other thing is, I was just telling you how my dad took care of his girls. My daddy took care of us. He was our protector, our teacher, our everything, our guardian. My daddy that morning crumpled at my feet and cried, telling me my sister was gone. I'd never seen my dad cry like that before, and I've never seen it since then. But it's something you don't forget. Stays with you. We had Irene's funeral on the Saturday, and it was huge, as you would expect for a 12-year-old. Drunk driving doesn't just affect a family, it affects a community. My sister played softball. My sister worked with mentally challenged children. My sister was an avid, she was a good student. All of the community came together. It affected so many people. So we had this huge funeral. And I really do not remember a lot about that day. But I do remember this. At the end of the funeral, everybody was out of the chapel except my parents and myself, and we were given some final time to say our goodbyes. And when the caretaker came in and closed the casket for the final time, I will never, ever forget the scream that came out of my mother's mouth. And it is something that comes from so deep inside. And it is the scariest, most horrifying scream I've ever heard in my life. And I will never forget that sound as long as I live. It never leaves you. It's been 41 years. And when I talk about it, I still get goosebumps. It's horrible. We spent the next few weeks after Irene's funeral packing her clothes, returning stuff we just bought to go back to school, explaining to people we don't need this anymore because the little girl who picked it out was killed by a drunk driver. It's awful. We just had Thanksgiving. There's an empty seat at my table. Christmas is coming. And as much as we love Christmas and we have family and I have grandchildren now, there's a part of me that dreads it because there's a certain amount of heartache that comes with it. Christmas morning will start in wet grass, looking at a piece of marble with my sister's name on it because someone chose to get in their car impaired. That should never happen to anybody.
Well, thank you, Rhonda. As hard it is to hear that story, I can only imagine telling it. I'm sure that it brings pain back, but I do think it's important for people to hear. I don't want to focus too much on the offender, the person who took Irene's life, but I do think it's worth talking about some of the case and what happened that many decades ago. And that includes, what did you know? I know you said as a four-time repeat offender. But can you talk a little bit about what you remember about the criminal proceedings back at that time, including what was the most difficult part and how your family felt going through that process? And again, 40-something years ago.
Yeah, 40 years ago, things were a lot different. So the offender was 22 years old. He was from our hometown. He lived very close to us. He had a family. He had small children and his wife was pregnant.
Wow.
So during the proceedings, as things went along, and I will tell you that my family did not get communications from the DA's office. They were not involved in decisions. They were not notified of things going on. And that's one of the things as a MADD advocate that frustrated me to hear about that happened back then that's not happening now. And we'll talk more about that, I'm sure, as this goes forward. But they weren't given any options. They weren't given any input. And ultimately, they were not even given the opportunity to give a victim statement in court when this person he pled to the charge of gross vehicular manslaughter, ultimately. One charge, not two. He killed two people. But one of the things that sticks with me, Shelley, that I will never get over is because his wife was pregnant at the time of this crime, the court was courteous enough to delay all court proceedings until this man's child was born and he had the opportunity to bond with the baby before he had to go away and serve his sentence. Meanwhile, my parents were pulling together money from whatever resource they could find because they had to bury a baby. And I will never understand how that could have happened even 40 years ago. That to me is just a slap in the face to all victims.
Yeah. Okay, so Greg, I'm going to bring you back in at this point. What can you tell us about, just knowing what you heard from Irene about what happened to her sister? Can you talk us through some of the current DUI laws and how under our current laws, this repeat DUI offender who caused obviously death could potentially be charged and sentenced today?
So I'll break that into two answers for you.
Okay.
First, let's talk about the current laws. There are two ways currently to get a DUI under California law. One way is if you are under the influence, and the other is if you are over a per se limit. And we'll start with under the influence. Under California law, a driver is not allowed to drive while under the influence of alcohol, drugs, or a combination of alcohol and drugs. And that includes prescription drugs. Under the law, a person is under the influence under California law if as a result of drinking or consuming an alcoholic beverage and or taking a drug, his or her mental or physical abilities are so impaired that he or she is no longer able to drive the vehicle with the caution of a sober person using ordinary care under similar circumstances. So what that essentially means is if you have ingested alcohol or a drug and as a result can't drive just as good as an ordinary sober person that is paying attention and being careful, then you are DUI under California law. Now, the second way you can get a DUI is if you are over a per se limit. The per se limit in California law only exists as it relates to alcohol. There is no set per se limit, for example, for marijuana or cocaine or methamphetamine or prescription drugs, but it does exist for alcohol. So under California law, a person is automatically considered DUI if they have a blood alcohol concentration of 0.08% or higher at the time of driving. The second question you asked is how a person might be charged or sentenced today. So today, a person would be charged and sentenced differently, and the whole court proceeding would be very different than how Rhonda described it with her parents and with her sister. So under California DUI laws, there are a few different ways this could be prosecuted. A repeat offender, like the offender in Irene's case, who caused death, could be charged under California law with a second-degree murder. Now, under California law, that is called a Watson murder, and they primarily come from repeat DUI offenders. The way it works is when a defendant pleads or is sentenced, they are given what is known as a Watson advisement. Essentially, that is where a judge tells the defendant that drinking and driving is dangerous to human life, and that in the future, if they kill someone while DUI, they can be prosecuted for a second-degree murder. If they then do kill somebody in the future, based on the prior plea and them having direct knowledge of the dangerousness of the DUI, we can, and our office does now, charge second-degree murders. The sentence on that type of case is 15 years to life. It's also possible in some situations that a repeat offender that causes death is charged with a vehicular homicide. There are two code sections for that, which are Penal Code Section 191.5A and 191.5B. One is for vehicular homicide while under the influence of drugs or alcohol, where the driving is grossly negligent. The other is a vehicular homicide while under the influence of drugs or alcohol, where there's ordinary negligence. On a grossly negligent homicide, a person can get a maximum sentence of 10 years. And on the ordinarily negligent vehicular homicide, the maximum amount of time is 4 years. If a repeat offender causes a serious injury but not death, so you can imagine in this case if Irene was able to survive and it happened today, the maximum sentence typically on a DUI is 3 years, and that would be prosecuted as a felony. However, there are enhancements that exist if there is a serious injury. There are two different kinds of enhancements based on the significant nature of the injury. There's a 5-year enhancement if the injuries are so significant that somebody, for example, is paralyzed or loses function of a organ, for example, if their lungs no longer work and they have to be on a machine, or they have some other significant injury to an organ. There's also a 3-year enhancement that exists for anybody or any defendant where they cause great bodily injury. Under California law, great bodily injury is any injury that is more than what would be considered minor or moderate harm. And a jury ultimately decides whether something is more than minor or moderate. But a typical example of a great bodily injury would be a broken bone. And finally, a repeat offender can be sentenced and will be sentenced to higher overall sentence if they have a significant criminal history. So the 3 strikes of laws still do apply in DUIs, because anybody who kills another person or directly causes a great bodily injury themselves, personally inflicts a great bodily injury, that is considered a strike. So if an individual has a prior strike or 2 prior strikes, they will be sentenced under the 3 strikes law, which can mean that somebody in a vehicular homicide or even in a DUI causing great bodily injury could be sentenced to 25 to life. I have prosecuted those sorts of cases before and had somebody sentenced to life. So for example, a person with prior DUI causing injury and a prior robbery who also now commits a DUI causing great bodily injury or vehicular homicide could receive up to 25 years to life. In the case of Irene that Rhonda talked about, that person with 4 priors would likely be charged now with a Watson murder and would face 15 years to life here in Sacramento County.
Thank you so much for that, Greg. So Rhonda, after hearing Greg talking about current laws and what could have happened, I forgot to ask, what was the sentence that offender received?
So he, and I will tell you, he was a 0.15. and he was sentenced to 3 years and served 18 months in a minimum security men's facility. And that was a plea of 1 count of vehicular manslaughter. So we always say one life didn't matter. To this day, we don't know which one didn't matter, but one didn't matter. And we didn't have an input on that. We weren't allowed to have any voice in that. So,
and that is also where there's a difference now, Shelley.
Exactly.
Currently, we have victim advocates who are assigned to the families on these cases, and the Marsy's law has been passed, which gives victims and their families rights that may not have existed 41 years ago.
Right.
Part of that includes that at a judgment and sentencing, the victim or the victim's family in a case like this can show up and make what's known as a victim impact statement to the court. That impact statement goes through exactly how the family has been impacted, whether it's emotionally, spiritually, or financially. It gives them the opportunity to address the judge and to address the defendant with how this crime has impacted them in their life, and ultimately ask the court for the sentence that they would like to see, or if the court is intending to give a sentence lower than the family would like to see, to let them know the displeasure they may have with that lower sentence, which I assume in Rhonda's case, the family really would have liked doing, given the 3-year only sentence that this offender received.
Right.
So Rhonda and Greg, really, obviously we've made progress. Rhonda, as you were saying before we started recording, we haven't made enough progress, but we have made progress.
Right.
What else, as a victim advocate and surviving family member, would you like to see change to make more progress on, whether it's the laws or the victim advocate side? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, as a victim advocate for MADD, I mean, one of the things we do at MADD is we work with lobbyists all of the time for stronger laws when it comes to sentencing, when it comes to DUIs. And that's not just after somebody's been killed. You know, one of the things that we have in place here is the interlock device, the device you blow into. And in our state right now, that device is not required for all offenders. We know that device saves lives. Right now, only repeat offenders are required to use that. First-time offenders are not always required to use that. Now, in my case, who knows? This guy's a 4-time repeat offender. Had he been required to have that instrument in his vehicle, maybe that night he wouldn't have been able to start his car. And that's just a small piece. The technology gets better every single day. And we're now looking ahead to a few years down the road when there's going to be technology in new cars that's not as simple as blowing into something. It's going to be laser. It's going to be able to read your face, your cues, and it won't be just for alcohol. You know, that we're dealing with other things. We have drugs, we have legal drugs, we have illegal drugs, and those are harder to detect. And I think the technology is in the process, and we will have it someday. And cars are going to be armed with this, and we're going to see changes because of that. But until that's in place, we need to hold people accountable for the choices that they are making. And they are choices because there are other avenues to get safe rides home.
Right. Okay. So obviously, Rhonda, it's been 41 years, but what has the lasting, I mean, you talked a little bit about the holidays and things that are still very, very difficult, but what has been the lasting effect on you and your family, especially since Irene was so young?
Yeah. You know, I was saying it earlier in my, when I was telling you how it happened, how, 12-year-olds don't carry an ID. My 12-year-old children carried an ID. My 12-year-old children carried cell phones. It changes who you are and how you handle things. And, I probably raised my children with a very, very short leash, not because I'm a strict person, but because I was scared. I didn't let them go places. I didn't let them stay overnight. I didn't let them go to parties and do things that maybe some of the other kids did, but it was fear. And, I told you earlier too, how my dad, the night that Irene was killed, he slid that window open and waved goodbye to her. And, today my parents and I are very close. And I mean that physically and emotionally. My parents live 10 steps outside of my back door. I see them every day. I'm so blessed. But to this day, Shelley, when I get in my car to leave, if my daddy's outside, he cannot wave goodbye to me. He will turn his back and walk away, and sometimes maybe put a hand in the air. And I've had people say, boy, does that make you feel kind of bad that he won't even wave goodbye? And I was like, it's a reminder that he's so scared that's going to be his last interaction with somebody that he loves. He can't do it. And people just don't realize that your day-to-day activities change. And the things that you do and the things you decide to do change, all because of one person's decision to be irresponsible. Your entire life pattern changes. And like I said, the empty chair, Christmas, Thanksgiving, Mother's Day, Father's Day. Not only that, with Irene, we have a crash day and the day she died, because Irene was hit on August 26th and she died on August 27th. And so when I was a teenager living at home on those 2 days, I wasn't allowed to leave my house. And people will look at that and go, well, that's pretty silly. It's a day on the calendar, not to somebody who's been impacted like my family has. It's a fear. So it has long-reaching impacts.
Wow. Well, the purpose of this podcast is to prevent, to educate, prevent, try to save another family from going through, Rhonda, what your family went through. So, Greg, in addition to prosecutions, can you talk more about some of the prevention efforts, including this podcast, that are being made under this OTS grant program?
Would be happy to. So we are making several prevention efforts at our office related to DUIs as well as drug DUIs. One of the things we do is we partner with Arrive Alive California to educate high school students about DUIs and drug DUIs. And they have a great program where we go to high schools and do actual presentations to students at those high schools. The program includes a DUI defendant taking a plea in front of those students. Typically, the judge then makes a speech to the students about DUIs and different DUIs that they have seen in their courtroom. I make a speech to the students. The defense attorney will make a speech, and often they have a law enforcement officer who talks to the students about DUIs, as well as a guest speaker, somebody like Rhonda, who shows up at those programs. And then at the end, we answer questions from those high school students about DUIs, drug DUIs, and vehicular homicides in our experience. And the goal there is to educate them to make better decisions than to not commit DUIs, but instead to get rides home from either Uber or a Lyft or a family, or do something other than drive home while intoxicated. We also, at our office, do a youth academy that happens once a year here, where we have young students who come directly to the district attorney's office. They are part of a larger program, but part of that program includes a mock trial where we educate students about DUIs, show them what it's like in the courtroom when a case is prosecuted, and then answer any questions they have. We also do a citizens academy once a year, which is similar to the youth academy in our prevention efforts. We do this podcast that you're listening to now, 4 parts, which is once per quarter, educating the public about DUIs and DUI related topics with the idea of prevention. And as part of the programs we've talked about, we also distribute educational materials. So we have flyers that we hand out at the Citizens Academy, at the Youth Academy, at the high school, and at other activities that we would participate in. And finally, as part of prevention, we do help train law enforcement officers in effective DUI investigations and report writing. That means that I specifically will go to law enforcement agencies and directly train those officers. Good reports make for good prosecutions. Good prosecutions lead to convictions. And the hope is that those convictions are a wake-up call so that people don't commit repeat offenses like the offender in Rhonda's case.
Great. Thanks, Greg. And Rhonda, tell us about the work that you're doing with MADD.
MADD has a lot of outreach programs as well. One of the things that we do is we get into the local junior middle schools and high schools. We have a program called Power of Youth, where we talk to students about making good choices and the effects of drugs and alcohol on the maturing brain and how that can affect you lifelong. We also have a program for parents called Power of Parents, where we work with parents on how to have those hard conversations with your children about drugs and alcohol. We work with law enforcement as well. We go out and work with local agencies. We brief with them. We actually volunteer at DUI checkpoints. We talk to the community about the dangers of drinking and driving. We host community events. Our community event going on right now is our Taiwan On for Safety event. You'll probably see some of MADD's red ribbons around town on local law enforcement cars right now, where we are encouraging people to get sober drivers. And we have also publications and educational materials that we're handing out at all of these events and in the community. So MADD.org is our website. There's a lot of resources and materials on there as well. And these presentations are always offered at no charge.
Great. And we'll have a show notes page with links to these resources. And Rhonda, if you don't mind, we'll have a picture of Irene on there as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Rhonda, I'm going to have close with you. Is there anything that you want to leave listeners with today as we end our discussion?
Absolutely. The holidays are here. And, one thing I like to point out, especially with MADD, is a lot of people are under the misconception that MADD is against alcohol. And that is absolutely not true. If you are 21 years of age or older, MADD is not against the choice of having a drink. MADD is against the choice of getting behind the wheel. I just like to encourage everybody to plan ahead and get that sober driver. And like Greg mentioned earlier, Uber, Lyft, it's never been easier to get that safe ride home. The key is to plan ahead before you start enjoying your evening. And the second key is your designated driver is not the person in your group that has had the least amount to drink. Your designated driver is the person in your group that has had nothing to drink. That is your sober driver. That is your safe ride home. So get those share ride apps on your phone. Make sure you get a safe ride home. It's for yourself. It's for your family. It's for your community. Save everybody the heartache of what my family's had to deal with and many others in our community have had to deal with, and just push that button and get that easy ride home.
Right. And even though we're talking about the holidays, this is really a message for all year round.
It really is. And, we say this about drunk driving, and you can't say this about many things in life. Drunk driving is 100% preventable 100% of the time.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you both very much for this very important conversation. So we hope our listeners share this podcast and really get involved in helping preventing family and friends from driving impaired and just keep everybody safe. So thank you both very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. You can find all of the Justice Journal podcasts on our website at sacda.org, iTunes, Google Play, and YouTube.